To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, hold listening or discussion groups, pick up a copy of Health Communism, Short History of Transmisogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and today I'm here with my co-hosts, Artie Vierkant.
Hello.
And Tracy Rosenthal.
Hello.
And just to let you all know at the top that by necessity, Baby Death Panel is joining us for this recording today, so apologies in advance for any baby noises that may become a part of this episode. The three of us are going to be discussing something that we've long warned was coming, a carceral shift back toward the era of the total institution that is no longer just a threat, but is now official policy. On July 24th, the White House issued a sweeping executive order called Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets. It masks a dangerous pivot in homeless and mental illness policy behind the language of public safety and state benevolence. On its face, it looks like a crackdown on homelessness, drug use, and so-called public disorder, and it definitely is, but when you read it closely and understand the broader context, it also becomes clear that this is the foundation for a renewed and expanded system of mass institutionalization in the United States. This order uses pathologization and the language of care to justify a new regime of confinement, forced treatment, and the organized abandonment of support programs and infrastructure that are non-carceral, like housing first, direct cash support, and harm reduction services. In so doing, it echoes longstanding Republican and Democratic calls for a return to mass institutionalization, psychiatric detention, chemical incarceration, and punitive systems of control under the banner of compassion. It positions disabled, unhoused, and poor people as threats to be managed through removal and warehousing. So in this episode, we're going to walk through what the executive order actually says, line by line, and explain what it means. We're also going to trace how it signals a real ideological shift towards the re-legitimation of institutions that were publicly discredited and dismantled through decades of organizing by disabled and mad people, as well as service providers in the deinstitutionalization movement. So we're going to explain how this order constructs the legal, structural, and ideological need for forced treatment and carceral care, and how these moves are not designed to alleviate suffering, but to disappear those most harmed by a political economy from public space and from public consciousness.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important executive order to go through, in part because in this, I think we really see this confluence of housing struggle and healthcare struggle or mad rights struggle becomes really, that overlap becomes very obvious here, because we have, on one hand, as we'll talk about, as I'm sure that Tracy will get into a lot, we have this enormous attack on really decades of housing policy, and we have this complete redirection. I mean, in many ways, it's a redirection of the state in a similar way that we've already seen with the Trump administration in so many aspects, towards just more avenues of sweeping people off the streets, like we're seeing with ICE detention, and political imprisonment of prominent people organizing in solidarity with Palestinian liberation, things like that. And then in another very real sense, it's also attempting to roll back really decades of mad rights organizing victories.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as both of you said, this is such an immense overlap. I feel like, as you said, thinking about this order as reflecting the legal, structural, and ideological justifications for an expansion of detention as the sole means by which to solve social problems. And we see that, as you said, with the use of ICE detentions. And here, I think that not only does this represent a backtracking of the victories of organized disabled people in the struggles against asylums, it also reflects the counterinsurgency to abolitionist and decarceration movements. And in many ways, invents mass incarceration by another name precisely in the moment when so much of our organizing on that front has been victorious. And so I think that we see these new budget avenues coming through the federal government that redirects funding for housing to funding for carceral shelters, forced treatment centers, and detention centers, and what likely will be even tent cities. And that is the form that Trump has promised on the campaign trail. And so I think that thinking about this reframing of a housing issue as an issue of law and order and the continued use of detention as the sole means to solve social problems. It's like the biggest theme. I also just like before we start out, I was reading Donald Trump's own statements in releasing this order, and I thought it might be useful to have some of his words about the justification for this order. And so this was last week. When he introduced this, he said, "When leaders come to see me to make a trade deal for billions and billions and even trillions of dollars, and they come and there's tents outside the White House, you can't have that." And so I think that for me, that really establishes the basis of how this administration is in many ways reflecting a long-term retrenchment against unhoused people, just the audacity with which someone can supposedly make an order that addresses the problem of homelessness, but is actually just about producing an environment to conduct business. It doesn't really get any more literal than that.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before we get too far into this, I think it would be good to just establish from the beginning what the order is saying and sort of the justification that it's giving for itself. So we'll start with sort of the framing of it, and then we can get into sort of more specifics about policy changes that they're advocating for here. Because remember, again, this is an executive order. In some cases, there are things in this order that Trump can do unilaterally, but in other cases, this is also just in the way that so many of the other executive orders that we've talked about before, this is just sort of a statement of intent. Mm-hmm. But of course, as we've seen with the way that the courts have folded to previous executive orders of Trump's and the whole situation unfolding under, I mean, just look at like the impoundment crisis that we've talked about a lot on the show, for example. I think it's fair to say that you can't just sort of dismiss this as, oh, it's just an executive order.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
But so this executive order, again, was from July 24th, 2025. It is called Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets. And the beginning, which declares its purpose, reads as follows, quote, Section 1, Purpose and Policy. Endemic vagrancy, disorderly behavior, sudden confrontations, and violent attacks have made our cities unsafe. The number of individuals living on the streets in the United States on a single night during the last year of the previous administration, 274,224, was the highest ever recorded. The overwhelming majority of these individuals are addicted to drugs, have a mental health condition, or both. Nearly 2/3 of homeless individuals report having regularly used hard drugs like methamphetamines, cocaine, or opioids in their lifetimes. An equally large share of homeless individuals reported suffering from mental health conditions. The federal government and states have spent tens of billions of dollars on failed programs that address homelessness, but not its root causes, leaving other citizens vulnerable to public safety threats. Shifting homeless individuals into long-term institutional settings for humane treatment through the appropriate use of civil commitment will restore public order. Surrendering our cities and citizens to disorder and fear is neither compassionate to the homeless nor other citizens. My administration will take a new approach focused on protecting public safety, unquote. And so I think it's just important to say from the top about this, the entire framing, we have this classic myth that unhoused people make cities unsafe, that people who are unhoused are only living on the streets because of some sort of inherent pathology, right? That they are mentally ill, that government must, quote unquote, address the root causes of homelessness, by which it means that pathology, the pathologization that it is declaring falsely that these people have. And on top of that, that failure to act on this is a failure of, quote unquote, compassion. Mm-hmm. So we have just sort of the entire basket of what we've talked about variously at different points as care washing, as carceral sanism, you name it, that we have to help people by hurting them. We have to disappear people into treatment under the auspices that they are a danger to themselves unless they are forced to behave normatively. And that, I think, is going to be the subject of a lot that we talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this opening point sets up the moral panic, right? Like, it's obviously not, quote unquote, evidence-based. It's pure vibes. It's coded language of ideology that's meant to justify the criminalization of poverty, madness, disability, or any non-normative behavior, like choosing to sleep outside, for example. Ultimately, like, it uses the, nominal claim to public safety as a way of justifying containment. And it has this historical echo that mirrors the rhetoric that was used against, for example, first wave deinstitutionalization in the 50s, and also has been used in favor of expanding the prison industrial complex during, the expansion of mass incarceration. Ultimately, like as Artie said, it asserts that this root cause that it's claiming to uniquely be combating here is individual pathology. And in so doing, it also absolves the political economy of, by default of being involved in this at all. The problem becomes other people, people's destinies, their pathology, their diagnoses, the fact that they are in public versus being out of public view. And ultimately, this pathologization of poverty is a total erasure of the structural and economic causes. And also it's a narrative about causality, this myth of disordered individuals in need of a cure. It turns organized abandonment into individual failings, positions, mad and unhoused people as inherently dangerous rather than exploited and dispossessed. And while it doesn't come right out and say, we're bringing back the asylums, it does, as we're going to talk about, essentially mandate the conditions under which mass institutionalization will become the state's only practical response. And you can see that telegraphed from the very beginning here, where you talk about needing to step up long-term commitment, long-term warehousing, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add to some of that, I think it's really interesting that the first number cited in this executive order is itself extracted from the broader number of unhoused people in the United States, which is, over 700,000. It's 771,000, almost 500 people who were counted as part of the, point in time count, which we all know is designed to be an undercount. But I think that it's really important that he's making the move to extract the number of unsheltered people from the number of unhoused people. And it's participating in this sort of long process of cordoning off sections of the population from each other. And we see this in many ways as the quote unquote homelessness crisis is addressed separately from the crisis of housing. To me, that really just is a continuation of that work. I think it's also the use of the language, surrendering our cities, to people living outdoors, and the
to
way
endemic vagrancy.
Yeah.
I mean, the use of the term endemic.
And surrendering, which is also a word that comes from like virality, or this idea of, it's interesting to continue to use that language of blight and contagion and disorder as endemic. I think that again, this is the way that our interests are like completely aligned. It's like revealed even in that sentence. And I think that, that sort of long tradition of revanchism, of turning a housing problem into a problem of law and order is really important. And I think, just to sort of drill down into this idea of this, fundamental debate about the root causes of social problems, and that has been effectively ongoing since the 1970s, which is, are problems inherent to capitalist economies, are they social problems and economic problems, or are they effectively moral problems of individuals? And I think that, for me, just situating this order in all of these trends that we're naming really sort of helps us see like what its use are. And of course, we can also just defeat the lie that the overwhelming majority of people who live outdoors suffer from some kind of severe mental illness. Like the data just simply doesn't support that. So we should know not to expect any better than for him to outright lie in the context of leveraging what is effectively a hatred of poor people. But it is fascinating that it's like in the first paragraph.
Absolutely. And I think this actually provides us kind of an opportunity here because they are uniting the struggles here for us in a way, housing struggle and disability or madness struggle, because when you look at this order, even in just the brief bit that I've read so far, they're using this sort of longstanding myth that homelessness is caused not by capitalism, not by the political economy, not by the market, but by individual failing, quote unquote, endemic vagrancy, pathologization, that they're using this as justification to what exactly? Well, in part, yes, to sweep the streets, which we'll talk about more, but also to expand involuntary commitment, to expand psychiatric incarceration of people, to make it easier to do so, to make it easier to hold people for longer. And the simple equation that this sets up is they will be trying to involuntarily commit more people. Where do those people go? Right? They're creating a problem that they will then have to, or that they will then, pretend to be filling or solving with new institutions. The only way that they could do this, expand these carceral crackdowns, expand sweeping people off the streets by using systems of psychiatric incarceration, is by expanding sites of psychiatric incarceration. And when I say that, it's not just sort of within this order, it's also something that I think it's important to state that Trump and the right have long been pushing for. I mean, on the one hand, you have the right at large, which has, since the dissolution or really reformation or metamorphosis, I guess you could say, of the old state mental asylum system, has spent the intervening decades pining for the return of the asylum and repeating the lie that the population of unhoused people and the population of incarcerated people in this country are so large because asylums, quote unquote, emptied out into the streets and into prisons, which is not true. And then you have Trump, who has spent his modern political career talking about this endlessly as well. And I want to make sure that we kind of hammer this home, because this is something that most media outlets, I think, seem to pay almost no attention to. Partially, I think, because involuntary commitment and psychiatric incarceration is also something that has become a liberal talking point. You see that in Gavin Newsom, in Kathy Hochul holding up the New York State budget earlier this year to secure both a mask ban and an expansion of involuntary commitment, right? But you have, for example, I want to play a clip actually from 2019, because much like we saw with Medicaid cuts, where I think it was in the episode called Waste, Fraud, and Abuse, I played a clip from Russell Vought that was from kind of the tail end of the first Trump administration declaring what they wanted to do with Medicaid. And we saw like exactly the same, practically word for word rhetorical construction for the ways that they went about attacking Medicaid and trying to impose work requirements on the program. This battle that they unfortunately just won, right? We saw that in 2019. Similarly, just at the tail end of the Trump administration, we also saw a very similar outlay of exactly what they want to do with psychiatric incarceration and expanding or re-implementing an asylum system that I now think that this order is our sort of first evidence of them actually truly pursuing. So let me just play this clip. This is from December 19th, 2019 at what was billed as a mental health summit during Trump's first administration.
In the 1950s, there were over 250,000, but it's really 550,000. Could be probably, there's no really accurate way of figuring it out, but they're looking at 610. They have numbers that are all over the place. But these were people in mental hospitals and mental hospital beds in the U.S. By 2016, this number declined to 37,679. They had a much more accurate number. The first they didn't really know, and the second they knew, 37,000. But it was anywhere from 550 down to 37,000 beds. There are more than if you look at it, over 100,000 homeless individuals with serious mental illness. And we must give major consideration to building new institutions. You know, when I was growing up in Queens in New York, we had a number of mental institutions, and I'd look and I'd see these big buildings, and all of a sudden you go and you don't see them anymore. And you say, what happened to all of those beds? What happened to all of that work? And where are those people? And in many cases, those people are living on the streets. It's much different. And somebody made a decision a long time ago, and they did it for budgetary reasons. But we have to take care of our mentally ill. We have to help people that are having problems. But I see it so many areas of, in Queens and other areas, New York City, you saw these massive buildings. In some cases, they did great work. I guess not in all cases. But you don't have them anymore, Dr. Drew. You don't have them. They're gone. And you say, and these are thousands, tens of thousands of rooms. And you say, well, we have more population now, and yet we have far less beds and rooms. So we're doing something about it. At the same time, we need to keep very dangerous people off our streets. We want to take care of the mental illness, but we have a lot of very dangerous people on our streets.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an important quote. And, you know, one of the things that I always think is really important to mention when we're thinking about what it means for there to be calls to reopen the asylum system, this, you know, brings us to this intersection we're talking about between housing and Madden health justice, because turning to the work of Liat Ben-Moshe, good friend of the panel, she's been on the show many times. She wrote a fantastic book called Decarcerating Disability that is all about deinstitutionalization. She has this idea called the new asylum thesis that she writes about in chapter 4 of that book, which is all about this. And essentially what she talks about is that this idea that closing asylums resulted in this direct increase in the populations of unhoused people and in the populations of incarcerated people is not only wrong, but it's also a manner of using the reified category of the quote unquote homeless mentally ill and using the idea that, you know, which is often repeated, that prisons are the largest service provider of mental health care in the United States, which is a line you hear often. These two framings and the new asylum thesis itself is a way of essentially avoiding the conversation around the criminalization of housing insecurity that occurs after deinstitutionalization, right? Not simultaneously with, but after deinstitutionalization begins in the 1950s. So you have the idea here is that when institutions were open, this was the era of the total institution. So you have this regime where the smallest thing, the smallest non-normative behavior can get you incarcerated in an asylum for life, right? This is the era of the total institution where there are people of all different pathologies who are held in these institutions for decades, if not the rest of their lives. And so starting in the 1950s, you have a movement from within the asylums to close them down. And part of that has to do with the conditions of the asylum, and part of that has to do with certain changes in how the state funds these and how many people are in asylums and how states can afford this type of warehousing care, right? And so the new asylum thesis basically posits that that era of the total institution was perfect and great because all of the people with non-normative behavior were swept up off the streets and put in these institutions, and you didn't have to look at them and you didn't have to think about them. And, you know, the kind of idea of, oh, well, some of them were probably getting care even though some of these institutions were horrible. They were all horrible. They were all absolutely horrible. The conditions in these institutions were abysmal, and that is part of the reason why deinstitutionalization happened. Deinstitutionalization also never was actually funded the way it was promised to be funded. And so you have this kind of idea that perpetuates that, oh, well, we didn't totally meet the promises of deinstitutionalization, and we let all these people out, and you conveniently leave out the criminalization of housing insecurity. You conveniently leave out changes in the housing market, in the labor markets. And in terms of like healthcare access, for example, during the same period, you leave out the rise of mass incarceration, which is part of the war on drugs and part of these other dynamics. And you say, oh, look, here's a really easy example of what happened to these people. This is the same population that has been moving from the institution into public social life who needs to be moved back into the institution. And this is kind of like the the totalizing narrative of this being a simple problem that needs to be fixed the way we used to fix it, essentially, is the argument that's often made. So just to sort of like put a finer point on this, essentially this executive order declares an emergency, right? Endemic vagrancy. It's framed around public disorder, visible madness, quote unquote, urban decay, danger. And then it ultimately demands this coordinated action from both law enforcement, health systems, and housing authorities that would roll us back to the era of the total institution. And it, you know, as Tracy said, it offers no meaningful investment in any kind of infrastructure that would actually address people's material needs. That's not the point of this. The point is identification and removal. And it directs people to be removed from public space and routed into systems of coercive treatment and warehousing. But the question becomes, as already talked about, treatment where? This is the kind of sleight of hand that's happening. And ultimately, this order pulls out so much funding from things like Housing First, things that could actually give people access to shelter, pours it back into these coercive, forced alternatives, to borrow your word for it, Tracy. And ultimately, like, the logic becomes that the order itself may not demand new asylums, but the policy environment that it creates, whether that's through the shifting of funding from more affirming alternatives to forced treatment, housing that requires like participation in drug programs, things like that, carceral treatment facilities, by taking it sort of and putting funding fully into those carceral avenues and pulling it out of anything that's like at all leaning away from the carceral pathways, the order invents a policy environment that is going to necessitate a return to asylums, which, you know, that quote from Trump of, you know, things used to be great. We had all these buildings and they housed all these people and now they're gone and we need to bring them back so that we can look at the buildings and not look at the people inside of them anymore, is essentially what this order is setting up in terms of what would be required by some of the provisions that it prioritizes, essentially.
Right. It doesn't necessitate, I guess, rather it produces its own justification for that. Yeah. And we see that so to continue through this executive order.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.